We welcome you back to this channel. Today we explore experiences with buried objects, where a couple finds a box that releases a grieving spirit, a student discovers an ancient diary, and a child unearths a photograph, awakening a dark presence. Go ahead, turn off the lights, and let's take one more step into the world of the unknown.
The secret of the garden.
My wife and I had waited for this moment for years. We had finally saved enough to remodel our old house on the outskirts of town. It was an old building, with more than 100 years of history, and it had a charm we couldn't resist. The first days were exhausting but exciting. Tearing up the old floorboards and knocking down walls felt like uncovering secrets and opening a time capsule. One day while working in the garden, I discovered something strange. Beneath a thick layer of dirt and roots, I found an old wooden box. I carefully lifted it and took it inside the house, excited to discover its contents. When I opened it, I found a carefully folded baby blanket, and wrapped in it, a worn-out stuffed rabbit. Its button eyes, faded by time, seemed to look at me with a sad and empty expression. It had a strange smell of dampness and mold, as if it had been buried there for decades. I showed the find to my wife, who suggested we clean it and keep it as a curiosity. But from that moment on, something changed in the house. Strange things began to happen. Small noises at night and inaudible whispers that seemed to come from the walls. One night, while trying to sleep, I heard a soft cry that seemed to come from the hallway. I got up, convinced it was just my imagination, but when I opened the door, I found the figure of a woman. She was standing at the end of the hallway, her face hidden by a tangle of dark, wet hair that fell in disordered strands. She wore a white dress soaked and torn at the edges, and her entire body seemed to emit an ethereal and spectral glow. Her eyes, deep dark pits, reflected an indescribable sadness, and her skin, pale and translucent, gave the impression of being almost unreal. Terror paralyzed me. My heart pounded, and a chill ran through my body, leaving me unable to move. The woman turned and, seeing me, slowly faded away as if she had been a shadow rather than a real presence. From that night on, the apparitions became more frequent. The woman followed me everywhere, her empty eyes fixed on me, always whispering words I couldn't understand. One day, while working alone in the living room, I saw her clearly. She was standing by the fireplace, her hands outstretched toward the stuffed rabbit we had left on a table. "It's mine," she said in a voice that seemed to come from a very distant place, an echo of desperation and pain. "Give it back to me." Her voice was laden with such deep sadness that it chilled me to the bone. I realized then that the stuffed rabbit was not just an old toy. It belonged to her son, a child who had died a long time ago. The woman, a grieving mother, had been unable to find peace in death and was now trapped in an eternal cycle of pain. Anxiety and fear began to dominate my life. Every night I feared encountering her ghostly figure. My sleep became erratic, and my wife noticed my growing paranoia. But how could I explain to her that I was being haunted by the spirit of a desperate woman? One night, I woke up with a chill running down my spine and the sensation of a presence in the room. When I opened my eyes, I saw her again, this time closer. Her thin hands were outstretched toward me, and her mouth moved in an incomprehensible whisper. "Give it back to me," she repeated, her voice barely audible but filled with a desperation that made me want to cry. I decided that I had to do something to calm her spirit. That night, I took the stuffed rabbit and the baby blanket and brought them back to where I'd found them. I dug a deep hole and buried them again, this time saying a prayer for the lost soul of the woman and her child. As I did, I felt a presence beside me, as if she were watching my every move. Things improved after that. The apparitions ceased, and the house regained its calm. But I would never forget the look in the woman's eyes and the pain they conveyed. Her presence was no longer felt. Although the house is now renovated and bright, the memory of that woman and her pain will never completely leave me. In the stillness of the night, I sometimes still feel a chill, reminding me that some secrets of the past are meant to remain buried.
Whispers from the past.
My name is Sarah. What I'm about to tell you happened during my last year of high school. I've always been a curious person, sometimes too much for my own good. That day, my mother was supposed to pick me up after school. As she was running late, I decided to explore the farthest and most forgotten corners of the school. For a while, I had heard rumors about an old dry well in the backyard, covered in weeds and almost hidden from view. Something about those rumors drew me in, like a magnet. As I was heading to the place, my mom arrived, so I decided to come back another time, better prepared. I returned 2 days later. It was a cloudy afternoon just before dusk. I found the well easily. The legends were true. The vegetation covered it, but not entirely. I began to clear a path around it, driven by a strange sense of urgency. Once in front of the well, I saw it was covered with dirt, so I started digging with my hands, convinced I would find something there. After an hour of effort, I touched something hard. I carefully unearthed an object wrapped in time-worn fabric. It was a leather diary, seemingly old, soaked with moisture and mold. The cover had the initials JM engraved on it. I opened it carefully and discovered it belonged to a boy named John Michael. From the dates written inside, I deduced it belonged to a student who had attended the same school over 20 years ago. I was excited by the find, as the school knew of John Michael, a boy who had died under mysterious circumstances. The first pages recounted his school life, friends, and dreams. But as I read more, the atmosphere grew darker. John Michael spoke of a particular teacher, Mr. Brown, who used to punish students excessively. He also wrote about strange events at the school, whispers in the hallways, shadows that moved on their own, and a dark figure that followed him in his dreams. Each diary entry was more disturbing than the last. I couldn't resist taking the diary home. That night, I read it until the early hours of the morning, unable to put it down. The last pages were chaotic, filled with scribbles and incoherent phrases. John Michael was terrified, convinced that Mr. Brown and the dark figure were responsible for the disappearance of several students. From that night on, strange things started to happen. It began with unusual noises in my room, inaudible whispers that seemed to come from the walls. One early morning, I woke up and saw a shadow at the foot of my bed. A tall and slender figure with bright eyes that seemed to be watching me. I blinked, and it vanished, but the feeling of being watched did not go away. At school, things got worse. My classmates began to avoid me, whispering among themselves and moving away when I approached. Once, while I was alone in the library, I felt an intense cold and saw books falling off the shelves as if pushed by an invisible force. Each day, the entries in the diary seemed to come to life around me. I decided to investigate more about John Michael's death. I talked to former teachers and reviewed old records. I discovered that Mr. Brown had been fired shortly after that unexplained death and that other students had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Mr. Brown died a few years later in a car accident, but some said it was a curse. One night, while reading the diary for the umpteenth time, I found a page stuck to the back cover. It was a letter from John Michael addressed to whoever found the diary. It said, "He will find you. You must return the diary to the well and let it rest." The next day, I took the diary back to the well, feeling a mix of relief and terror. I dug in the same spot where I had found it and reburied it, praying for the strange events to cease. But as I filled the hole, I heard a whisper behind me. I turned and saw a shadow fading away. Since then, I haven't seen that dark figure or heard any unsettling whispers. But every time I pass near the well, I feel a shadow watching me from afar. I try to calm myself by thinking it's my last year, and soon I won't be near that well anymore.
The photograph in the box.
This happened when I was 12 years old. I was always very curious, though I never thought something like what happened would change my life forever. My parents had bought an old house on the outskirts of town. It was a Victorian mansion with large gardens that had been neglected for years. The front yard was overgrown with weeds and trees, with gnarled branches that looked like skeletal hands. One afternoon, after playing alone in the garden for a while, I decided to dig in the dirt with a small shovel I had found in the garage. My intention was to find something interesting, something that would calm my curiosity for strange things, some treasure buried by former owners. After a few minutes of digging, the shovel struck something hard. I can't describe the excitement I felt at that moment. I scratched the dirt with my hands and, after a moment, uncovered an old wooden box. I was very curious, but the box was locked with a small padlock, which only heightened my interest. After several attempts, I managed to open the box. Inside, I found only a black and white photograph. The image showed a family, a man and a woman, along with 2 children. They all stared directly at the camera, but their eyes were strangely empty, as if they had no soul. Around the photograph was a frame made of dried flowers and wilted leaves. As I entered the house with the photograph in hand to show my parents, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air turned cold, and a feeling of heaviness filled the atmosphere. My parents, however, were not home. They were at work, and I usually stayed home alone until they returned at night. I decided to place the photo in my room, on a shelf. That night, strange things began to happen. I woke up at midnight to a dull noise coming from the hallway. At first, I didn't pay it much attention, thinking it might be my parents, and tried to go back to sleep. However, I heard the noise again. Feeling a bit scared, I decided to check it out. But when I opened my bedroom door, there was no one there. The hallway was dark and silent. When I returned to my bed, I turned to the shelf, and the photograph was no longer there. Turning around, I noticed it had moved. Now it was on my desk, staring at me intently. I tried not to give it much importance and went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep well. I dreamed of the family in the photograph. In my dream, they stood at the foot of my bed, staring at me with those empty eyes. I could feel their presence, cold and oppressive. The next day, I told my parents what had happened, but they thought it was just my imagination. However, things got worse. The lights started flickering for no reason. Unintelligible whispers were heard at night, and small objects changed places. One night, while I was trying to sleep, I felt a cold hand grab my foot. I jumped up and turned on the light, but there was no one there. Fear paralyzed me, and I realized that everything that was happening was related to that photograph. I decided to investigate the former owners of the house. In the town library, I found an old newspaper article that talked about the tragedy of the family who had lived there. It was said that they had died in a mysterious fire, but their bodies were never found. The photograph I had unearthed was the only evidence of their existence. That night, I took the photograph and brought it back to the garden. I felt that I had to return it to the place where I had found it. I put the photograph back in the box. I dug a deep hole and buried it again, making sure to cover it well with dirt. The next day, the atmosphere in the house seemed to have changed. The noises stopped, and the feeling of oppression disappeared. My parents never realized what had been happening, or maybe they didn't want to see it, but I never forgot. Even now that I am 25 years old, when I am in the garden, I feel a presence watching me from the upstairs window. I don't know if it's my imagination or not. But one thing is certain. Some things are better left buried, and the secrets of the past should be left alone.
Thank you for journeying with us through the dark passages of these stories. If you enjoyed them, give us a like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss more tales of terror. Until next time. where fear will once again be your companion.